they get to a point in the love bombing phase where they can't go any further. So in other words, once they've won you over, they can't continue. There's nowhere else to go. There's only so much you can give into that. And when they feel or think that they've gotten to that point, because of their emptiness inside and because of their inability to have stable or healthy relationships, they start then looking for reasons why this thing would blow up or could explode. So let's talk about the abuse cycle. All right. So the narcissistic abuse cycle is, and I'm going to use the term narcissistic abuse cycle, but this applies to any of the big four personality disorders, which is you have your narcissism, your borderline personality disorder, your histrionics, and your antisocial personality disorder. Each one of them show up a little bit different, but we'll kind of focus or dial in on the narcissist or borderlines here, and kind of what happens, because the cycle is very similar. And the reason why they fit in a similar category on the DSM is because there seems to involve similar patterns for how they handle their relationships and how they interact with the world. Basically, in a nutshell, we're all social animals, and we're all designed to connect with each other socially. And it's some people have that compromised, right? That social connection, the ability to connect to others is compromised for in some way, shape, or form. And there's different ways that things can be compromised. Like, for example, someone who has something neurological going on that affects their communication. Like, these are not personality disordered people, but people with autism, people with Asperger's, people on the spectrum, pervasive development disorder, things like that. So these are individuals who neurologically they're compromised when it comes to communication, and they have some struggles with that. And those are on spectrums. But the personality disorder is an affected or a compromised, we'll say a compromised ability to bond with another person in a normal, healthy way. All right. So the way us human beings are designed to bond with each other and have a good, neurochemical reaction to each other and to people, they're unable to do that. So they don't have the ability to connect with people in the same way that you or I, or we'll say unaffected people, can connect. And so because of that, you end up with all of these traits, and you end up with a person who just has an inability to have that genuine human concern for another, or I shouldn't say an ability, but we'll say a compromised ability. So one thing to look at and keep in mind here is that this is a spectrum, okay, that's going on. So there are some people that are low end of the spectrum, and they can, they're the low end of the spectrum. People are pretty well functioning, but they still fit the characteristics, and they're just compromised. Higher end of the spectrum are people who are completely manipulative and very dangerous. All right. So that's when we'll say BPD, because normally women are borderline and end up turning out to be borderline personality disorder. There are some women that fit narcissism. There are some women that fit antisocial, but BPD tends to affect women the most, whereas males, tend to be affected the most by narcissism or antisocial personality disorder. And the reasons for that have to do with how we're genetically wired and our brains are wired. And so that just puts a woman in a position to be affected with more of the BPD traits, just, from the just fact of her femininity and those things. And so yeah, you got to remember this is a spectrum. So, you might have somebody who can get help and be, able to function and be okay to a point, right? And then you have some people that absolutely can't. All right. So their capabilities are going to vary, and that's something to keep in mind. But we're not going to get too detailed, because I could literally talk about this for several hours. To give you a little bit of a background, if you don't have it, let's look at what the abuse cycle is. So the abuse cycle is you have an idealization phase. So this is where this person will idealize you and see you as the best human being on earth. And then that's where they're going to love bomb you. So the beginning of the relationship is where that love bombing is going to happen. And that love bombing can mirror that genuine desire. And that's what can be confusing about it for some guys, and what we're going to try to differentiate today. Now, after that idealization period, or love bombing phase, they call it, things start to move into a devaluation phase, where they start to devalue you and bring you down. And then eventually moving to discarding you. So that's the three phases. Now, once they discard you, or they've devalued you a lot, they might discard you, and that might only be temporary. They'll do something called hoovering, which is suck you back in, and then, start back with, sprinkle a little bit more love bombing in and some idealization, and then go back through the cycle and repeat the cycle. So understanding why this happens, this is really important. The reason why this happens is because part of their personality disorder is they don't have a sense of self. That's very confused. Like, their sense of self is not normal. And often with BPD, there's a deep, dark, like, despair and just feeling of being just an empty person, like being empty inside. And they'll report, feelings of that emptiness, right? Or that just, not feeling or being able to understand like who they are. And so who they are is predicated on how others supply their ego, and how others, and their environment around them. So their sense of worth is based on how others will do what's called supply, which is basically change themselves and do things for them and alter their way of being essentially for them. They can't bond in a normal human way. So what they'll do is they'll meet with somebody, and they'll bomb them, and they'll have all of these love feelings and all this stuff. When they meet a new person, that person is not necessarily bought in. And so what happens is they're bombing them with love and sex, all these great feelings. And so that person starts to change themselves and change who they are, essentially, to become more bonded to them. And so they start making these changes, and basically she's winning, essentially, because this other person is trying to, she's trying to get this person essentially and get their, we'll say their love, but get their attachment. And so as this person becomes more and more attached and more into this relationship with this person, that's how this person is sort of changing who they are, essentially, and changing their behaviors and thoughts and emotions for this person. And those changes, in doing it to appease or to win this person, or to love this person, or be with this person, that's what supplies that ego. That's what gives them the sense of worth. And so from there, okay, they get to a point in the love bombing phase where they can't go any further. So in other words, once they've won you over, they can't continue. There's nowhere else to go. There's only so much you can give into that. And when they feel or think that they've gotten to that point, because of their emptiness inside, and because of their inability to have stable or healthy relationships, they start then looking for reasons why this thing would blow up or could explode in their face, or why they could be abandoned, or how you could end up turning out to be a bad person. And then they end up then devaluing you and bringing you down. By saying devaluing you is like they start creating problems where problems never existed before, and they start, criticizing and seeing you with contempt and bringing you down in value in their own eyes. And bringing yourself down, you start to see yourself as lower value, because what the victim does is your identity becomes wrapped into the relationship and into this other person. And so they end up bringing you down because your sense of self is wrapped up into what this other person thinks about you. And so then they start saying, well, basically their actions, words, behaviors starts demonstrating, you know what? I don't really think that you're all as great as I thought I was. Or, you're this terrible person, or you're this bad person. And so you start, you were getting all of this love and sex and validation from this person. She removes that stuff and then says basically sends you the message, well, that's your fault. You did these things. You did something that I didn't like. And so now you're not worth this validation and love that I used to give you. And that puts the victim in a position of pining and trying to get that back. And that's what devaluing is. And so now, in order to appease that ego again, because they've only gone so far up the ladder, the only way down to go is down the ladder. And so they start systematically devaluing you. And then, starts to become more rapid. Their emotions will shift. They'll throw some more love bombing in, right? And then, but that'll be fleeting. That'll be, in moments, and then boom, back to devaluing. So it just continues this process, and it gets the victims to a position where they're literally behaving and doing things that they would have never done before. They're losing their identity in this relationship. And then when they get that person to the lowest point that they can perceive, and they feel like that this person can't get any lower, they're not going to be willing to continue to change for her as much as as much or as impacting as they can. So I guess we'll cut ties now and we'll discard this relationship. And so that's when they leave. And the way that narcissists do it's different than BPDs and so forth. And so that's the cycle. And you want to be familiar with that. But the best thing to do to not, because it's very damaging. The victims of this find themselves basically in a traumatic situation with these partners. It messes with who they are, and people make, permanent decisions for temporary problems. We'll say that, self-harm and things like that, and really get into dark places when they're victims of these relationships. So that is your overview of what happens. Now, the best thing to do, however, is, to not get in these things in the first place. Now, a note, though, a word of note is because you have to understand during this love bombing phase, these people with personality disorders, BPD people, don't have a sense of self. So they're adopting a personality that suits the situation and who you are. So in other words, they're becoming your perfect partner. That's essentially what they're doing. All right. So they're becoming the best person that you could ever imagine. They're paying close attention to what would drive you and your attraction triggers, and they're adopting those things, adopting those traits and personality traits and behaviors that would get you essentially to fall in love with them. Right. And that's what they're doing in that love bombing phase, because they're wanting to move you into this attachment to them. And that's what they need. They need your attachment. And so they're trying to push, to pull you in, and they're doing it by being this idealized person that you have for a perfect partner. And so that's what they do. But what you have to realize is when you break up with these people and you miss them and you have all this heartache and all these bad feelings, that you don't actually miss them. Who you miss is the person that they pretended to be. Okay. So like when guys are in these breakups and they're like, and by the way, I've been there myself, so I know from personal experience, when they say things like, man, I really just want her to get some help, right? What you really mean when you say that is that you want her to return to the person that she pretended to be so that you can live happily ever after with her. But you see, the problem is that person never existed. Okay. So even if she goes and gets help, she'll never return to the person that she was when she was love bombing you. She's going to be a different human being, whoever that is, right? The person that you fell in love with, if you're getting out of these relationships, never existed. And so it's really important when you're working through a breakup on this, that you go through the steps to breaking off that neurochemical attachment to this other person. And that attachment that you get caught in with this abuse cycle is like a drug. Okay. It's very much like a drug, people behave like drug addicts with these partners. All right. And that continues to, promote this abuse cycle when they hoover you back in and then repeat the cycle. And by the way, for anyone listening, in my female listeners as well, this applies. This is actually pretty universal. So there's women who get caught into relationships with guys like this. There's different dynamics and details, but the cycle and what the overview of what happens tends to be the same, right? And so that's what you have to remember if you're getting out of one of these things. That old person that you miss and that you fell in love with never existed in the first place. There is no amount of help that a BPD person can get that's going to return her back to the person she was during the love bombing. That's over with and will never happen again, because that person was love bombing you because she had a personality disorder and was unhealthy. And so even if she was able to get help and get rid of, I won't say get rid of the disorder, but get control of the disorder and start having an ability to have healthy connections with others, she would never go back into the idealization that she had for you. Because even if we could wave a magic wand and all of a sudden she's 100% healthy, well, then she's not going to idealize you. By definition, she won't idealize you the way that she did, because that idealization came from an unhealthy place that she was in. So I really want you guys to understand that, because a lot of you guys get caught in this and your addiction tells you to win this person over, or you want to get her back. Guys have to, they go through a breakup cycle with me in coaching sessions and stuff like that. In one of my programs, they go through this cycle with me to break the attachment. But a lot of times their mindset is like, well, I'll break the attachment because that'll push her into getting help, and then we can be together later. Like that's sometimes that's their only motivation. They're so attached to this other person, and it's such a drug addiction, and they know it's bad for them, that the only way that they can rationalize breaking the addiction is in hopes to be able to do more of the drug later. And the problem is you'll never get it. You're chasing a high that will never, ever happen again with that person. What you have available to you, though, is a better high that's healthier in a healthy relationship. And that's another thing that people get caught into, is they think the biggest schema or unconscious belief that gets developed after these things is that they believe that they'll never have as good of a relationship or as tense of a relationship or have these as good of sex or as good as of the emotions in a relationship in the future. In other words, I'll never have as good as sex as I did with a crazy person, right? And that's what people start to think. They believe that becomes a schema, is that, well, crazy BPD sex is the best sex. And I'm never going to have good, that kind of sex with a healthy person. And I'll tell you that that's actually not true. It may have been true for you, some of you guys listening up to this point. And the reason that's true for you is because you haven't been able to seduce a woman to a point, a healthy woman, to a point where she is insane and crazy about you and giving you that level of, we'll say, BPD desire, or even more so inside the bedroom and in your times alone together and all that stuff. But then the good thing about those relationships, though, is there's no downside, right? So you can have all the intensity, but without the downside risk, because that person's healthy. But what that requires, though, is for you to hold frame and have seduction skills. And you have to take in, and this is not just pickup skills. This is getting her emotionally to the next level. All right. So your future, if you want it, after these relationships break up, is to have better than that. And I don't just mean better in terms of more stable, because that's what people think. They think, well, it'll be more stable, but it won't be as fun or it won't be as exciting. No, you can have even way, way, way more excitement, but you have to learn the seduction skills to get it there.